I'll be delivering 4 lectures. Today 2 lectures and tomorrow 2 lectures. So in these lectures, I'll be trying to highlight the early society in South India, primarily based on archaeological remains and also literature and epigraphy. I'll be focusing on the period between, say, 1000 BC, roughly, what is known as Iron Age, the beginning of Iron Age, then down to 5th century CE. After 5th century CE, we have the development called, state formation. We have Pallavas and other political dynasties start ruling from 5th, 6th century. Then we have a different kind of establishment emerging, especially temple building activities increase. So I am actually focusing on the transition period in South India. So before going into the Iron Age and early historic developments, in the first lecture, I thought I will focus on, I'll share some of my perspectives on history and archaeology, and also some of my ideas on early cultural formation in South India, based on my reading and understanding of various categories of evidence related to early cultures in India as well as South India. From my understanding, I think India, generally in academics, not sufficient attention has been given to humanities and social sciences. There's so much importance placed on disciplines like engineering and science and technology. I think the same kind of attention is not placed on humanities and social sciences. There is always the problem of syllabi, learning according to the syllabi, which is, which are constructed in the contemporary period, and the branches of knowledge. For example, if you take the way past is taught in many universities, literature is separated, Indology is separated, art history is separated from archaeology. So actually we have fragmentation of knowledge as far as the study of past is concerned. So from my understanding and also by reading several other literature, I realized we need to somewhere integrate. For example, we were taught archaeology, we were never asked to read literature. Literature was seen as a separate category. Similarly, epigraphy was seen as a separate category. Because the way archaeological syllabus is constructed in many universities, there is a limitation. Again, there are so many things going into the construction of the syllabus. Later on, when I moved to Kerala, I studied in Deccan College, I moved to Kerala, then I moved to the department where they specialize in epigraphy and archaeology. I realized ancient inscriptions and literature are very important. Similarly, ethnography. They are also very important for understanding the past. If you are going to study the past just based on written documents or text, we are going to miss many of the things, ignoring literature and other forms of evidence. Actually, humanities and social sciences, I am basically stressing this point mainly to the students, not to the faculty members and senior researchers, because they are important for understanding the society in which we are born, we earn, and we live and exist. And they are essentially important because we have a social life. We interact with the people. So we need to we are interacting with the people in the real life and also through digital media, especially in the context of globalization and what they call as deglobalization. I think humanities and social sciences are very important. So coming to the discipline of archaeology or anthropology, I think these disciplines have actually, fragmented the knowledge, and also they teach only one particular aspect to the student. Therefore, we need to have a holistic perspective, and we need to understand the interrelatedness of the discipline. So we need to cross beyond the boundaries. So what I am trying to sort of present is archaeo-anthropo-history, a unified discipline where we look into all kinds of evidence sources to understand the past. So coming to the history, again, we build history at different levels, at the national level, at the regional perspective, again, at the local level. So we need to focus history on all these levels. So the space, time, and community individual, we need to focus on all these dimensions. Again, history at the local level, village history is very important. Sometimes focusing on the communities and individuals is also very important, because based on some of our field work, we realized that documenting local people's, voice and their memories are very important. I'll just show you a small video that we did the experiment with our students. What we did was we went to field in order to teach the students. We felt, classroom lectures have a limitation. We visited, we took the students to some sites and we started documenting. This kind of method we adopted only in the recent past, and we found a lot of interesting information from the field which is nowhere reflected in any kind of written document. We visited a temple near Nagapattinam where we met with a person who mentioned about Akkasalai. Akkasalai is a term that refers to a mint. So we were very interested with the term. Then we followed, we went to another village, and then we found there is a temple in the name of Akkasalai. Akkasalai is actually a mint, ancient mint. The term Akkasalai occurs in 10th, 11th century inscription. And there is a temple with the Ganesha temple associated with Akkasalai. When we explored further, did ethnographic work, we found that there was a settlement of metalsmith. They were making bronze images, minting coin in this particular area. Then I came back to internet. I was trying to search the term Akkasalai using Google Earth map and also Google. Then I found several references for Akkasalai Ganesha temples, and they are, interestingly, they are nearby the street where Kamalas live. So this kind of spatial information, we go to the field and document the people's views, and then correlate with other literary text, and then correlate using digital media, we find interesting information. So this was a very good learning experience. Earlier we used to go to field and document people's view in a notebook. Now what we do is we try to document the landscape and also people's voices, and also we take our students. We normally in a day we travel for 50 kilometers and take the students, go to field and collect primary data, and we found this very interesting. And also we try to understand many things that are not found in the written record. That is where the ethnography is very important, especially for reconstructing the local history. So coming to the sources of history, students are generally taught only the archaeological sources and the written documents are the sources for reconstructing history. We don't understand that our own language, even our own body, human body is a biological archives, and common people, they also have cognitive archives in their memory. That also has historical information that need to be tapped. Then text as concrete register of ideas, written evidence, inscription, oral traditions, as I demonstrated, ethnographic work, they are also important. Similarly, environmental context, hills, lands, rivers, landscape, plants and animals, they are also important. Even we are using actually this knowledge as speakers of a specific language. We use this understanding to discuss about the past. Therefore, we use our own meaning, we understand into the past. So there are a lot of dynamics going on when we discuss about the past in the contemporary language, in our contemporary understanding. So this is very important that we need to understand these are the sources for history. And also you can't understand our Indian history just reading by 2-3 textbooks. One has to go to field, try to understand the culture, because I have been traveling in different parts of India, not only archaeological research and also understanding languages and the diversity and the way of life. These are also very important for understanding history. Without these kind of understandings, we cannot comprehend the Indian past. That knowledge, many of us, we use unconsciously, but we need to make conscious efforts to understand the past by visiting to places, understanding the landscape, understanding the oral tradition, understanding the language. So only then we can get an integrated comprehension of the past. These are some of the points I wanted to say. And archaeology is very powerful in the sense it can bring out the history of marginalized section. So it is capable of focusing everything from elite to the subaltern and also core to the margin. And again, most of the time we construct these images, core or margin, but in a sense, when we look at ancient text, we get into their emic understanding. Most of the time, we create conceptual categories like Aryan, Dravidian in the present day context. When we look into the ancient text, we get an understanding of the emic, their own understanding. So therefore, it is very important we understand both emic as well as etic generation of knowledge. We have to be conscious that we are generating categories and we are discussing, and we have to get into their mind and how they were classifying the world. Therefore, literature is very important. So I think already I have mentioned, how archaeology is useful for the reconstruction of the history of the voiceless people, and a true historic, holistic approach should incorporate all. So these points also, I think, I have already discussed. Identity of the people is another problem when we deal with archaeological context. Evidence is mute. We attribute meaning, we come up with some interpretation. Therefore, the knowledge that we generate has a lot of subjectivity. This is the problem of archaeology. Sometimes we think what we discuss is accurate, but actually we are generating our own views, and there are a lot of elements of subjectivity. So I'll discuss some more concepts like decolonization. From my own understanding, I found it very important to deconstruct some of the concepts that were created in the early period. This is something I try to understand over a period of my research by interacting with the people, common people. So sometimes we use categories like Aryan, Dravidian, and Harappan. These are all constructs that we use in the contemporary period, and they are much more complicated. Similarly, archaeological cultures are archaeologists' constructs. In the same way, Neolithic revolution, the unilinear model of evolution, that we have been taught from the early years, that has deep impact in our understanding. So in this presentation, what I am trying to argue is that Mesolithic or microlithic hunter-gatherers in South India were important factors because of the obsession with Neolithic revolution and because of the importance attached to agro-pastoralism or agriculture. These communities were considered primitive. Again, the terms like tribe or primitive, they are also heavily loaded, and we need to be very cautious. So what I am trying to argue is that these population, the population diversity emerged in South India somewhere in the Mesolithic period, at least from early Holocene. So that base was very strong, over which there were migration of people sometime, migration of ideas and other elements, trade and exchange, all that contributed to the development of the population. Essentially, I try to argue, that is the main gist of my presentation today, the Dravidian family of languages probably developed in the region of South India, probably from the Mesolithic or microlithic period, say early Holocene, about 10,000 years BP, and this formed the core of the population. And then there were things, probably ideas and goods and things moved from other parts of India in the later period. Again, I am not trying to construct South India as an exclusive closed zone. There were people and ideas were moving, because we do get evidence for this. This is the gist of my presentation. So these ideas already I presented. More than textbook. Again, when we focus on textbook, our understanding is very limited. Language, landscape, environment, literature, visiting places, experiencing culture are very, very much important. Again, self and other. Even we know there are so many controversies when people comment on somebody's color and all that that is happening now. When we deal with the past, there are several layers of understanding. We can divide this into two: professional understanding and then popular understanding. Professional academics, they have a kind of knowledge, they construct a knowledge, they create, they are, we can say, closer to the reality. But whatever these people do, they communicate their research sometime in the internet, sometime through media, and people get a and understanding. People have their own way of forming knowledge and they have their own understanding. Sometimes these are the people who get into the top. Sometimes they can become very powerful. They could again dictate or control research. Therefore, we need to be very clear that there are several layers of understanding about the past. One, even multiple views among the academician, and one popular perception among the people. When I say popular, it may also include scientists and other technologists who do not have subject expertise in archaeology or history. They may have a notion which can be equated with the popular notion. So again, as even archaeologists or professionals, we have our own understanding. We come from a society, so we have our own preferences and prejudices. Sometimes we have something in our mind, and we see that my own views are different. I am trying to think as an objective person, but still, the own understanding and affiliation of a person also influences the way things are perceived. I think these are some of the important factors that students need to take care. So coming to the the central or the last part of my presentation, here I am going to present on the early cultural formation in South India. We have several early conceptions about South India and the origin of people. Many of these notions emerged in the colonial period. We can say mainly due to the European arrival. And as I mentioned again, there is a strong popular understanding about South Indian culture or Tamil culture among the people. There is some history recorded in the memory of the people that is very strong. If you look at the literature, again, academics, as it is done in the history department, as it is done in the Tamil department, there is a lot of variation because they depend upon different sources, different references. So the idea of Lemuria is very dominant, or the continent of Kumari, which people believe that submerged, and some of the Tamils evolved from there. This kind of messages are floating in WhatsApp. Sometimes our colleagues in other science department, they send, see, there is a WhatsApp video on Lemuria continent about origin of ancient cities. So now what we see is there are so much of materials, digital videos and created, concocted, they all floating about the past in the digital media. Even especially the Android phone technology has made so many revolution. I think it has even influenced some of the archaeological research projects. So people are getting access to these knowledge. They are forming their own opinion. Sometimes these opinions are more powerful than the minority academics. So it is very difficult to dislodge these kind of views. 1 week back, I was discussing on the train with the public who was a doctor. He simply put me off. Okay, no, we know all that. We know the fact about Lemuria continent. Don't discuss with me. I know that. Now answer my question. See, the impression or the understanding that people have is so powerful, sometimes we are not able to counter. So generally in the Tamil literature, even in the historical writings, which are mainly in vernacular media, there is this particular question. Did Tamils originate in Indus Valley? Who were the authors of Indus Valley civilization? Did Tamils originate in Lemuria? There are two views. One view attributes the movement of Tamils from south to north based on the legend that is found in 8th century literature, which talks about the Sangams, Tamil Sangams, which shifted from south to north. So there is another view who says, based on Father Hiras and other scholars' identification, that they try to correlate with this Indus Valley civilization. I think this idea is very strong. In my opinion, civilization itself is a construct. When we develop the concept of civilization itself, we are showing a lot of partiality, and also the notion of tribe. We are trying to put a lot of categories and understanding into this. And there have been so much of debate on the authors of these civilizations. But my argument is, if you look at, these are the understanding people have and also people write based on the secondary literature. But when we look at archaeology, when we go on the ground and work, we find clear material evidence for people living there right from Mesolithic context. That is conveniently ignored. That is because conventionally these people were labeled as hunter-gatherers or as primitive. But my argument is the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers or food-gatherer groups were very ecologically oriented, they were very knowledgeable, and they had good understanding of the landscape. At a later context, when new material culture came, they adopted, and that contributed to the early cultures in South India. If you take the case of Sri Lanka also, they have some material. There was so much of connection between Sri Lanka and India. At some point of time, these two areas were interlinked. Because of the colonial notions, everybody started adopting this Aryan and Dravidian construct, and history has been so much misinterpreted, and it is very difficult to dislodge this understanding. But when you look at these archaeological evidence and linguistic evidence, we can clearly understand the reality is something different. So, why do we have to ask about the origin of a civilization? This was a practice that was started earlier. Who were the authors of this particular civilization? Aryan or Dravidian? Labeling people and community and identity. So, interest in identifying archaeology culture, they all have problem. We all tend to label people. You are this, you are that. It is basically a human nature or a habit of Homo sapiens sapiens. That idea has come into archaeological research also. We always want to identify who are these people, who were the authors, where did they come from, where did they go. So these kinds of research questions were raised earlier. Actually, we need to move away from that and try to understand culture more materially, based on the material culture and empirical analysis of data from the field. So coming to the human occupation in South India, the earliest human evidence for human occupation goes back to 1.5 million years ago, where Dr. Shanti Pappu has done some dating for the samples from Chennai, and she has identified some sites near Athirambakam as old as 1.5 million years old. Then for Paleolithic evidence, there are a lot of sites available in Andhra, Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. And mainly in northern part of Tamil Nadu, we have more sites. We have sites of Hunsigi Baichpal Valley in Karnataka and several sites in Andhra Pradesh, where Professor Padaya, Ravi Korisetter, M.L.K. Murthy and Michel Petraglia and other researchers have worked. So we have very clear evidence for this early substratum or what is known as Paleolithic, but we do not know how it developed into the Mesolithic or Microlithic period. But for Microlithic period, we have very clear evidence for these, communities occupying right from the hill areas to the coastal areas. So these communities were very powerful. They were using small lithic tools. That is why they are called as Microlithic. And they were occupying different areas. We also have evidence for this particular culture near Pamban coast. We also have evidence for this culture in the high hilly areas, which means that these groups were occupying these different areas. When we come to the early historic Tamil texts, we have the conception of Thinai or ecosystemic entities living in different areas known as Kurinji, Marudam, Mullai, Neidal, Palai. So my argument is some of these Thinai categories evolved or the foundation was laid in the Mesolithic or early Holocene period. Coming to this Mesolithic evidence, we have a lot of skeletal remains also coming from Sri Lanka. Some of them are datable to 30,000 BP. So clearly suggesting that there were people living in this part of the country right from the early time. So in pursuit of this Harappan civilization, we are completely negating or ignoring their history. That is the argument that I am presenting. So after the Neolithic culture, after the Mesolithic culture, we have Neolithic, so-called Neolithic culture or early pastoral communities appearing in South India around early 3rd millennium BC, somewhere around 3000 BC. Several researchers have worked on these culture. They were basically agro-pastoral groups occupying the central part of Andhra and Karnataka, and they are mainly found in the northern part of South India. They move probably to the south in a later context. When it comes to 1500 BC, you find more of their evidence in northern part of Tamil Nadu, say little south of Bangalore. So you have this particular core group of culture occurring mainly in this particular part of the country. And earlier scholars thought these were the population, they contributed to the development of Dravidian. My argument is these were some of the groups that occupied this Neolithic, say Andhra-Karnataka, were one component. There were already people living in southern part of Kerala and also Tamil Nadu in Sri Lanka. So some of these groups, they moved into these areas, and the dynamics of relationship between these groups contributed to the development of South Indian culture at a later stage. That is the argument here. I'll discuss some of the important sites. Ash mound site. There are several ash mound sites. Ash is called in Kannada Budi. There are villages in the name of Budi Galli. You can easily identify these sites based on Google search. Actually, I found this Google as a very good tool, also as Wikimapia, where local people, they list several names of the villages. If you search, interestingly, you find sometime archaeological site. We are using this as a tool to locate archaeological site. Place name study, as what historians call, that can be used by searching Google to locate archaeological site, even to understand the landscapes, for which no record is available. So this kind of searching on the Google helps us to identify certain important information which are preserved in the oral tradition. If you search for Google Budi Hall or Budi Halli, invariably there will be a settlement in Karnataka with the ash mound. So these kind of place name search is very important. Kodaikal, Kupkal, Payyamballi, these are some of the important sites with Neolithic evidence, mainly found in Andhra and Karnataka, and some of the sites are found in Tamil Nadu. This is the view of a ash mound site where they have burnt a lot of ash, and it has accumulated into a deposit, sometime 10 to 15 feet in height, and you find pure ash in various stages. Some of them are highly vitrified. Scholars argued that these people burned them periodically during the festival, something like Pongal. Even in, nowadays, earlier it used to be a tradition in North Arcad. During the time of Pongal, people used to burn, and they send the cattle through these fires so that some of their diseases could be cured. So there are several theories put forth for the burning of these ash mounds. They are extensive. There is one site near, it is called Kudithini, it is near Bangalore, it is near the highway connecting Bangalore and Chennai. So the highway cuts across this particular ash mound. These are the earliest Neolithic evidence found in South India. And if you look at these sites, the landscape is very beautiful. You also have evidence for rock art, and you find a lot of castellated hillocks. And interestingly, nearby the hillocks, you also have water resources. So they were herding their cattle in that area and grazing. They were the one who first used ceramics in South India. And also at the later stage, you find evidence for metal use, small bits and pieces of copper. They also created different kinds of ceramics and also created rock art, bruisings. They were drawing cattle and other animals on the rocks in this area. And also you find these kind of Neolithic axes. They are found in several sites. They are known as polished stone axe. They are found in several areas. Right. Coming to the other sites, there are several other sites found in the region of Andhra and Karnataka, Piklihal, Maski, Kallur, and Brahmagiri, Narsipur, where we have clear evidence for these early farming settlements. Actually, Dorian Fuller from University College London has researched on the botanical remains from these sites. He has found evidence for several plant domestication, and also P.K. Thomas from Deccan College has identified several animal species. People were, herding cattle and also sheep, goat at these sites. So we have very clear evidence for this. This is the map, and I'm not sure it is very clear. Yeah. So these early Neolithic sites are found in this core area. We don't have any evidence for Neolithic in south of, say, Chennai, south of, say, North district, and it was considered these regions were backward, based on the unilinear model of thinking. So my argument is these regions also had their own microlithic culture, which were also very important because of the knowledge that they generated through interacting with the environment. Yeah, so these are the researchers. You can find their publications in the internet. Taylor and Foote, Alchin, Padaya and Ramireddy, Nicole Boivin, they have all published on the Neolithic cultures. These are the classifications by Alchin. He classified Neolithic into a first phase, second phase and third phase. And he argued that these cultures spread from the core area to the outer area. So as I already mentioned, we have evidence for animal domestication, sheep-goat pastoralism, cattle, and also some kind of primitive agriculture. That is how they call. And agriculture gains importance in the later period, and some sort of semi-sedentary settlements. That's what scholars argue. And you also find ash mound near the habitation. Earlier context, you have a lot of evidence for ash mound. In the later context, we don't have clear ash mound. Probably people were using the cow dung for various other purposes, probably in agricultural operations. Okay, I have just 20 minutes. I'll go fast. So, as I said already, the core cultural formation in South India developed in the Mesolithic times. And later on, these Neolithic communities, some of them moved into this region. So when we look at this literature, description in the later period literature, they label people as pastoral groups, as shifting cultivators. So you find multitude of identities. When you look at archaeological record, we call them as megalithic culture or black and red ware people. That is a picture that we get from archaeological record. But if you look at the literature, it gives so many micro identities that cannot be understood or reconstructed from just by looking at archaeological record. So my argument is that these early communities, I prefer the term community rather than the tribe. These one group of Dravidian language or Proto-Dravidian speaking people moved into South India somewhere in the area of Upper Paleolithic or in the early Holocene, and they diversified into different areas much earlier, and that contributed to the development of variations, linguistic variation in South India. These people were living in this part of the country for a longer time, and some of these people who moved into Kerala, especially in the hilly, cooler, high rainfall area, they developed a different kind of nasal intonation that led to the development of Malayalam. Similarly, another group or several other groups that lived in the eastern part of, say, South India, that developed different characteristics. And similarly, another group that moved into Sri Lanka, that developed different characteristics. So if you look at the population as well as the place name, actually place names are very important. Even my argument is some of the words that we use were created in the prehistoric period. So we underestimate the words. Though we speak, the words also should be considered as a kind of artifact. So the hand axe, we trust the hand axe more. Hand axe or other object. The words are also kind of artifacts that were created in the prehistoric time, and they were passed on generation to generation, handed over to the present. If you look at the place names, some of the village names in southern part of Kanyakumari and Kerala, they are very similar. Similarly, if you try to understand the ethnography and cultural components, you can see several cultural regions. So I would correlate, based on my understanding and some references, that southern part of Kerala and extreme southern part of Tamil Nadu and parts of Sri Lanka having one cultural group and one cultural population. Similarly, the Western Ghats of Kerala having one group of population, Coimbatore or Kongu region. If you look at the place names and the village names, in my impression is that some of the village names which have suffix based on natural features like Kal. Any place with Kal suffix in South India refers to a village nearby a hillock. So these names indicate some kind of geographical features. So similarly, I would identify 5-6 population groups. And I don't think these population groups came out of Southern Neolithic. Some people tend to argue that Southern Neolithic was the base for Dravidian population. My argument goes back, try to say that this population diversity was attained in the early Holocene or terminal Pleistocene, and these groups were living there. Suppose some people may ask, how can you find black and red ware everywhere? Actually, there is this idea of form. Sometimes communities using different languages, having different identity, may use the same material culture. So my argument is that when black and red ware ceramic was adopted, and several groups that came, when one community started using, several groups adopted to that. But that is why we have black and red ware all over South India. As an archaeologist, if you look at all black and red ware pottery lying everywhere in South India, we will label them as black and red ware culture or one culture. That is how archaeologists, they created their emic construct saying that megalithic culture of South India, the Harappan culture of this. We see same ceramics from our own notion, we construct a culture. This is where I am trying to argue that we need to deconstruct or break these identities, like even Aryan, like we have North Indian, South Indian. These are all constructs, but there are realities, they are much more deeper. So we need to deconstruct these categories and try to understand culture in a holistic fashion by looking at various evidence categories. I think I am almost done with it. Yeah, this point I wanted to say, we have black on red pottery appearing in the late Neolithic context in some of the South Indian states. Can we say this is because of diffusion of ideas, or material, diffusion of material, or diffusion of people? Maybe there is some connection between the Chalcolithic communities of Western Central and India and South India. Did some of these communities move to South India? It is a complex, there are complex questions involved, and we cannot answer them easily. Dorian Fuller has argued that botanical vocabulary of these Dravidian languages indicate that Proto-Dravidian was, there somewhere in the early period in peninsular India. So, can we argue South India was completely isolated, or can we argue that South India witnessed massive population migration? I would say neither. South Indian population groups developed mostly locally with the movement and exchange of a few groups, few individuals, material culture and ideas without mass migration. And South India's connectivity with Western and Central, Northern and Eastern India need to be studied. There is another point that I wanted to highlight. I am looking at the material culture and several other sources. In the argument for Aryan and Dravidian, we have completely ignored the eastern part of India. If you look at the material culture and the evidences, eastern part of India, and then it had connection with East Asia from much earlier period. We have evidence for shouldered silt appearing in the area as far as Orissa. Even if you get a lot of material cultural similarities, so clearly eastern part of India and northeastern India is a cultural zone which also partly includes Bihar and parts of eastern Uttar Pradesh, where there were things going on. There were interaction with eastern Asia and also Southeast Asia. So I think we need to take all these factors into consideration. We can't see regions as either closed or completely open. It is somewhere in between, and there were interactions happening on, in these areas, and that contributed to the cultural developments. This is a map showing the Proto-Dravidian and other languages. And what I have presented today is just hypothesis and some of my understanding. I feel that I need to work more, try to understand. As I work on place names, literature, epigraphy, and also cultural ethnography, I think I am trying to better understand the history of South India, and also undertaking field work. And looking at literature, these are also important as methods of history. I think I'm almost done, and thank you very much.
On this section, shall we take them now?
Yeah.
If you have anything which was not either clear enough or which triggered some question in your mind for this first lecture.
Thank you, sir, for that amazing lecture. Sir, I would like to ask, how would you then define the Aryan and Dravidian? Aryan and Dravidian.
Yeah, thank you. Aryan and Dravidian, I would say they are part of some, they are just some linguistic group, that's it. People speaking specific languages. We can't say that it is a single ethnic group. So many people might have learned the language, and this identity might have modified over a period of time. So as I already mentioned in my speech, South India, we can say there was one group of Dravidians living. So we don't know. The theory is that there were Aryan, Dravidian speaking people living in northern part of India. I don't have much information or research on that. So Aryan is not as simple as we think. Probably it had multiple layers of people. Similarly, Dravidian also may not be one single group. There could have been multiple layers, and maybe people could have spoken some other languages, and they all, some people probably lost their languages. So it is difficult to say. So we cannot treat this as one entity. Like I said, you can't, all South India is not one entity. It is much more complex. Same way, we can't say all North Indians are Aryans. It's much more complex. There were, even if you look at the Harappan realm, there were different communities probably. So it's much more complex. For anybody from other parts of India, all South Indians are one. But if you go into South India, there are multiple identities. So maybe I think we need to try to address these cultures from different perspective. We can't say, these are all whether, Aryan or North Indian. It is much more. My impression is that there were some groups of people living, even in Ganga Valley culture, there are evidence for people living in this area from, say, in the early Holocene or even before. So, because of our obsession with Aryan or Dravidian, we have ignored the archaeological record, which suggests that people were living in many parts of India right from early Holocene. In pursuing Aryan or Dravidian, in pursuing the authors for Harappan civilization, we have ignored the history of the people who have been living in the Ganga Valley or even various other places, central India. So our obsession with some concepts leads to us to certain direction. So what I am trying to argue is that we need to move away from these concepts, try to look at history holistically by seriously taking into consideration the archaeological record. Actually, Professor, this morning we had discussion with Professor Michel Danino. He was discussing with Vinod about a project trying to characterize the ceramic cultures of Gujarat, how these ceramics form evolved. I think we need to go from that level, go from below, try to look at the material culture, study its similarity. You compare a culture from a region with an immediately neighboring region, try to build a sequence, and then we may be able to answer some questions. I think that is more important rather than to look for these labels in the archaeological record. So instead of going from top to bottom, you go from the bottom to the top. So you may come up with some answers, and also what is the necessity of identifying these culture with a particular label? Why? Let us try to understand the culture from their own terms.
Yes, Professor Ambika has a question.
I have a question about the ash mounds. I wanted to know if they are very specific to some villages or regions, or is it general to all agrarian societies? If it is specific, then what is the reason? Is there any religious? Because I have not heard of ash mounds in. This is the first time I'm hearing, and other ash mounds in other parts of India where people keep cattle, other agrarian societies.
Yeah. Actually, ash mounds are mainly found in South India, mainly in Andhra and Deccan area. There are also some ash deposit in Balathal, I was told, that is in Rajasthan. And even in Tamil Nadu, I have seen some small ash deposit in the early historic context. So this particular specific group of ash mounds, they are found only in Andhra and Karnataka, that too probably for a specific time period. So we don't know, maybe they were burning them periodically. Earlier somebody put forward a hypothesis, they were remnants of iron smelting activities, but later on excavations by Alchin and other scholars proved that these people were penning their cattle in the center, in the cattle pen, living all around. So probably they periodically burned them, and sometime it is possible, yes, they were also burning as part of some ritual about which we don't know. Sometime even in Pongal, we have a ritual on the first day, burning whatever unused. We don't know, but again, sometime we cannot directly link a contemporary tradition to the tradition of the past. There is a probability that these people had some kind of rituals, and they are mainly found in this part of the country, in Andhra and Karnataka. They are very prominent. You can see them on Google Earth. If you search for ash mound, and you can see them, and we can, using this Google Earth, we can locate and map some of these sites. They have high concentration of ash. Sometimes they don't look like ash. They are highly vitrified. They look like smelted iron slag. That is why early scholars considered that as a remnants of iron smelting activity. Now it is very clear that they were remnants of burning cow dung. So we don't know what ritual was behind this ash mound formation. In the later Neolithic context, we don't have ash mound. Probably people were using cow dung for farming and other activities. So the ash mounds probably indicate these people had, they were mainly dependent upon pastoralism with very limited agriculture, and they did not use the cow dung for agricultural activities.
If I may quote a thought from Dr. Prabhakar, who is with us, whenever archaeologists do not understand something, they say it must be for ritual use. This is a kind of, right? You told me that one day. So I think, Dr. Selvakumar, perhaps we'll proceed to the, unless there is some other question.
Yeah, it's done. Okay, thank you. So this lecture focuses on early Tamil literature and society in South India. So in this lecture, I am focusing on the Iron Age culture that succeeded the Neolithic phase, and Iron Age succeeded the Neolithic. After Iron Age, we have early historic. As I already mentioned, the early historic, or what is known as Sangam age, is generally placed in 3rd century BC, say somewhat contemporary to Ashokan. And also, the early historic period in South India is defined on the basis of references to Chera, Chola and Pandya in the Ashokan inscriptions. Ashokan inscriptions mention about Choda, Pada, Satyaputo, Keralaputo. Actually, Keralaputo or Keralaputra is identified with Cheras. In Tamil form, Putra means Mahan, it becomes Man, Cheraman. Satya Putro, they say Satyaman, Atyaman. So you have these names transforming into other entities in the later historical context. So based on the references to southern kingdoms in Ashokan inscription, the early historic period is placed in 3rd century BC. In the 1st century BC, we have evidence for Roman trade connection in the form of coins and ceramics, which I will be showing tomorrow. So the Iron Age is the phase after the Neolithic, say circa 1000 BC to 300 BC. So this is a very formative phase. This phase is also known as megalithic, because people were building burial or funerary monuments for the dead people. They have different type of monuments. You find them in large number across South India. They are there everywhere in South India. You have some of the monuments in Nagpur. You also have some of these megalithic monuments in Himalayas, few in number, in Uttarakhand area and also in central India, a few in Gujarat, some in northeast India. But northeast India, they are in a different cultural context. They are of much later period. But generally, in southern India, say Andhra, Kerala, Karnataka, and also in Sri Lanka, they have identical material culture. So very interestingly, they have black and red ware pottery, cornelian beads, iron objects, and also bronze objects, few in number. So the Iron Age is generally covering this area between say 1000 BC to 300 BC. After that, we call this period as early historic. But in a sense, we have the same material culture continuing in the 3rd, 4th century. So sometimes it is very difficult to pinpoint a burial whether it belongs to Iron Age or early historic, because it's difficult to identify. You know, archaeology, there are a lot of problems, you know. Just by a pottery label, you can't identify whether it belongs to 1000 BC or 500 CE. It is very complicated. So we can broadly categorize these megalithic monuments between 1000 BC to 500 CE. The first phase is between 1000 BC to 300 BC. The second phase is 300 BC to 500 CE. Interestingly, for this period, we also have a class of literature known as Sangam literature. And this literature is very interesting is in the sense that it mostly has secular topics talking about peoples and their way of life. And you have a composition of several texts which tell about the social life. They also tell about the landscape, culture, way of life. Sometimes the objects or towns that are found in the archaeological context, they are also discussed. So we find a lot of correlation. So if you look at the literature independently, you get a different understanding. So if you look at the archaeological record and literature, you get a different understanding. I am not a Tamil specialist. I basically deal with archaeology. So as I said earlier, you know, when I started looking at literature, I found it very interesting. So I thought we can do a lot of correlation. Only by reading the literature, we can give better interpretation to archaeological records. So I started working with this literature as well as archaeology. So the Iron Age early historic period, as I said earlier, 1000 BC to 300 BC Iron Age. Early historic is 300 BC to 300 CE. sometimes it is very difficult to pinpoint the cultural development within this phase. So we are dealing with, say, 1500 years of development, and we cannot find a fine chronological resolution because it's very complicated. So sometimes we have to deduce based on the excavation of archaeological site. So this is from the site of Adichanallur, excavated by Archaeological Survey of India. Sometimes you find huge burial areas. Interestingly, if you look at the pattern of burials, we have evidence for burials, say, in India from the Harappan, and also if you take Mesolithic context, we have earliest burials from Ganga Valley, from the sites like Sarai Nahar Rai, Damdama, from the central core area of Ganga Valley. And here, these people had a separate area for the burials. If you take the Neolithic settlements of South India, the dead people were buried within the house. That is how scholars interpret. Sometimes we do not know whether they buried the dead and then abandoned the house. So some of the groups of people living in India, they have the practice of, especially in northeastern India, they bury the dead and then they abandon the hut. So here we have evidence in the Neolithic context that the dead were buried within the house, but we are not able to analyze whether after burying the people were living. We don't know, but when it comes to Iron Age, people had a very clear demarcation between living area and the place of the dead. The term in Tamil for the burial is used called Idukadu or Sudukadu, which means actually forest. So the place where people live is called Nadu. Where you live is Nadu. It is a binary opposition, you can say. Kadu is forest or nature. After death, you go to the forest or nature. So burial grounds are known as Idukadu, or cremation grounds are known as Sudukadu. Sudu means to burn. This terminology is also important. Sometimes the burials are located very near to the habitation area. Sometimes they are located far away from the habitation area. So clearly they had a concept of burial area, habitation area as separate entities. You have these references to these urns in Sangam literature. That is the beauty of it. There is one lady, there is a beautiful poem which is sung by a lady, which also reflects the social condition. This lady goes along with her husband in the deserted area across the pass. Her husband is died on the way. So she laments to the potter. She compares her situation to a lizard which comes along with the bullock cart's wheel from far away. She compares, she's widow, her husband is no more. She addresses to the potter, she tells, like a lizard coming along with the bullock cart's wheel, I came along with my husband. So because she doesn't have any motive other than she went wherever her husband went. Now that my husband passed away, O potter, kindly create an urn which is large enough to bury both my husband and myself. So the term for this is tari. Tari. So very clearly, see, when we correlate this reference and that reference, we clearly understand the cultural context behind. We also can assume that this is what we interpret in archaeology. Say, if a burial is larger in size, we attribute it to a chief or some socially important person. That based on this ideotechnique and other socio-technique argument of Louis Binford, who proposed the processual theory in archaeology, Uday Ravi Murthy has written a book. If you have time, students can look at it. Socio-economic conditions of southern megalithic culture. So here, Uday Ravi Murthy, who was in Indian Institute of American Studies at Gurgaon, now he has moved to Karnataka, Tumkur University. He used this particular Binford's concept, but here when we look at this literature, she tells, the native concept is understood. There is another poet who sings about a king the king is so big, so famous. So he was making so much donation to the people who came, who came to him searching for some kind of support. So now the poet sings, such a huge king, such a famous king is gone. Now potter, how will you make such an urn for him to suit his fame? I really pity your condition, because you have to use Mount Meru as a wheel and a huge mass of clay to make such a huge urn. So here, from the emic understanding, we get an idea of how people correlated the dimension of the material culture to the fame and the importance. Like that, if you look at literature, there are beautiful references. So there is one reference which talks about urn which is reddish in color. There is another reference which talks about an urn. I had a photograph. Exactly like this urn which was covered with another. This urn has a lid. So you get such beautiful references to the material culture in the literature. So when you understand these material culture, when you handle the material culture, when you read the poem, you get a better understanding. When these Tamil scholars, earlier they interpreted the material culture without really understanding the object, so they came up with a different kind of interpretation. When an archaeologist, after handling the material culture of the period, when an archaeologist goes and reads this literature, he or she gets a better understanding. So that is the idea. There is another beautiful poem which talks about, that is in Sirupana Tupadai, which talks about the landscape. The landscape is very beautifully described. It talks about the jackfruit tree on which there is a creeper of pepper creeper, and then underneath there is a buffalo sleeping. So this particular scene is beautifully brought out in the poem. This particular scene you can really enjoy if you go to Kerala. Even in Kerala, I have seen, in one place I have seen this jackfruit tree and then pepper creeper on the tree, and then people collect this pepper. So these poets who composed these poems, they were not writing from imagination. Yes, some of the ideas presented in the literature, they are imagination, but they have actually seen, they have traveled. So my argument is, if you want to understand Sangam literature, one needs to know Malayalam. So I was working in Kerala. For a year, I learnt a bit of Malayalam. So then I could reinterpret some of the words that are mentioned in Sangam literature. So though Sangam literature is written in Tamil, some of the words are found in Kannada, some of the words are found in Telugu, some of the words are found in Malayalam. Similarly, when we are interpreting the inscription, suppose if I am from Tanjavur region, I will not be able to understand the meaning of certain words. But a person from Madurai or from Kanyakumari will have a better understanding, because the term that is used in the inscription is still used by those people. That is why understanding colloquial language, that is why I would say, to understand India's history, one needs to know Sanskrit knowledge as well as Prakrit. So this is very important. Some terms, I come from Tanjavur region, where the Sanskrit influence is more because of the Brahmin migration in the medieval period. For the sides, we use the term Pakkam, which is actually a derivation of Paksha. Sukla Paksha or Krishna Paksha, that is, people use it Pakkam, as which for a note paper page also we use page. But if you go to another dry region of Tamil Nadu and Pudukkottai, they use a different term called Siragu. It is wing. The bird's wing is called Siragu. It is used for the settlement around the Tanjavur Brigadishwara temple in 11th century inscription. So to interpret this particular inscription, you need to have the knowledge, colloquial language spoken in Pudukkottai in the 20th century. So, this is where we have limitation. I can cite you another example where, we have to respect the knowledge of Homo sapiens sapiens. That's what I have cited this in one of my papers. Sometimes we experts or some experts, they think they know everything, but people's knowledge sometimes is very crucial in understanding and interpretation. A paleobotanical expert visited the site of Pattanam. He could not identify, they found a small piece of frankincense, which in Malayalam they call Kundrikam, in Tamil it is Kunglium, I don't know the Hindi name for it, frankincense. And this, one of the trench supervisor or the trench attendant, he said, sir, you burned this immediately. So we took a small piece and burnt. The 2000-year-old frankincense gave the nice flavor. So what could not be identified by a paleobotanical expert could be identified by a common person. That is where sometime in archaeology we have something called public archaeology. So we ask local people to interpret material culture. I think this is where we should value Homo sapiens knowledge. That is why, my earlier point. So though we may be expert reading text, reading, so many other inscription, but certain words spoken in a small region can give us good idea of interpretation. So you get a lot of beautiful reference to material culture in literature. This is another image of the lady painted on pottery from Kadabakale. Similar, expression is found in the rock art near Kadabakale, this one. And parallels are found in Adichinallur. What I am trying to present is, sometimes the forms are similar. So you find similar conception of images in area far away. So this probably suggests the same cognition, but it may be different culture. They may be belonging to different culture. Same way, I am trying to argue, you have this white painted blackened ware occurring in Aghar, similar pottery occurring in southern part of Tamil Nadu. Sometimes it is not necessary that people migrated. Sometimes these ideas move. Sometimes forms are similar. So megalithic burial in Nagpur is similar to megalithic burial in Kanyakumari or Nagarkoil. Does not mean that they belong to same culture. Sometimes people may borrow the idea, recreate it, but it may be, the culture may be conceived from a yamic perspective, from a different boundary. So that is why when archaeologists see two kind of material culture having same shape, form, it is not necessary that they belong to same culture. That's what I am trying to argue. Based on the blackened ware and megalithic burial monuments, archaeologists argued megalithic culture is as one entity. So based on my evidence, my research, and also looking at literature, I am trying to argue there were diversity. So at one point you see, archaeologists see everything is similar, but from other point things are so different. That we don't see, but this we understand by looking at early historic literature, which talks about numerous identity. Person from the hill, person from the coast, person from the farming area. You find a lot of diverse interpretations, diverse identities in the literature. These are the megalithic blackened ware pottery. They also have some form of post-firing graffito. Some of them resemble so-called Harappan symbols, but again it could be coincidence or sometime movement of ideas. Sometime, we find typical Harappan, similar to Harappan, this etched cornelian beads. But sometime, these ideas, similarly shell bangle, sometime there is movement of ideas through different sources. People were exchanging. Sometimes these ideas come in a later context also. So it is not necessary that people migrated. Sometimes ideas are passed on to one generation to another generation, and then they are transferred. Okay. We also find these kind of symbols on the burials. We don't know what exactly they mean. They have been creating a lot of symbols on the material culture. We are not able to interpret. This is a burial, cis burial from Brahmagiri in Karnataka. You can see this, it's very beautifully constructed. This is called swastika pattern. Actually, it is not swastika. What they have done is, they have done some kind of dry masonry by beautifully placing cut slabs one against another, created a chamber, and they have given support. You can see this. They have very intelligently this support, and they have this technique of veneering, you know, making outer side look flat, and inside they have kept the rough pieces of the rocks. So it's a beautiful structure. So you have similar schist burial occurring right from, say, northern part of Karnataka down to southern part of Andhra Pradesh. Are we going to argue they belong to the same culture, they are one and the same people? You know, they may be different by culture, maybe they shared same idea, they adopted the idea of making a burial monument in a particular manner. Again, some more megalithic black and red ware pottery from Adichanallur. Some more. Yeah, this is the site of Adichanallur excavated by ASI. Yeah. Typical material culture of the period. You also find these kind of legged jars from the megalithic burials. And this is another image, applique decoration from Adichanallur. It was found in fragmented condition. This has a bird sitting on a crop or sugarcane, we don't know. And then there is a lady, there is an antelope, and there is something like lizard. We don't know the meaning of it. So this was found. So we find these kind of artifacts from these burials. Okay, this is another pottery called russet coated painted ware. Yeah, some of them are repeating, sorry for that. These are some of the vessel forms. So by looking at the vessel forms, we understand, we construct the archaeological culture. This is another vessel form typical of megalithic period. You have this side looking like a snake. This is very characteristic, very typically of Iron Age. You don't find such forms in the later early historic context. Lids, so some more forms. So I basically showed the material culture of the Iron Age, which also continues in the later early historic period. Now I will move into the Sangam Tamil texts. Already I showed some examples how these material culture as well as sites are described in the Sangam literature. We have Sangam text, a vast corpus, which is very important for understanding the history. We have references to Mauryas and Nandas in the early Tamil literature. Very interestingly, it attributes Nandas, you know, hiding a lot of wealth under the river, and also it talks about Mauryan or chariots coming into. So we have a lot of references to various cultures, and this literature is generally placed between 1st century BC, 1st century CE to 3rd century. And there are two classes of literature, 11 Mel Kanakku, 11 Keel Kanakku, 18 works, 8 anthologies called Ettu Togai, 10 long poems called Pattu Pattu. They are placed in the time period of first 3 centuries of the Common Era, and the Keel Kanakku texts are dated to 3rd to 5th century. And you find more influence of Sanskrit in the text of Keel Kanakku, and also Jainist, Jain and Buddhist ideas are more seen in the text of later period. But even in the early text, you get clear, influence of Sanskrit. Some of the poets were Brahmins. That is also, their Gotras also mentioned in the literature. But interestingly, this literature talks about the social life of the people. These are the 8 anthologies. You can find them in the text. There are several books available. Aingrunuru, Ahananuru, Purananuru, Kalitogai, Kurundogai, Natrinai, Paribadal and Padittu Pattu. These are all compositions of short poems, sometimes 400 poems, small poems composed into one anthology, and they tell a lot about the society, people, king, heroic life and everything. Then we have 10 long poems. We have Thirumurugattu Padai, Kurinji Pattu, Malaipadi Kadam. Madurai Kanji is about the town of Madurai, and Mullai Pattu Pattinapalai is about the town of Kaveri Pumpattinam. And if you look at the literature, sometimes the texts compare women with the large towns. So the literature also talks about the large towns and the ships that came into these towns. So therefore, we can clearly correlate the towns and their prosperity to the Indo-Roman, so-called Indo-Roman or Indian Ocean trade, this happened somewhere in 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. So clearly, this evidence helps us to indirectly date this literature to this particular period. Then we have Perumbanattupadai, Purunattupadai, Sirubanattupadai. These are some of the poems are actually sung in praise of a local chief. See, it is like that. There is a big chief or a king, and he is famous, and he offers a lot of goods and prizes to the poets and other people. So one poet sings about him, speaking about his fame to the other people. That is how the poems, especially the Attupadai genre, they are of that type. Then we have Padinan Keelkanakku. There are 18 works in which Thirukural is also there. That these texts are placed between 3rd to 5th century. Then we have Chilapadigaram, a famous work by Ilango Adigal and Manimekalai. They are both of them, they are related to Buddhist literature and the town of Kaveri Pumbatinam. They are dated in the 5th century or slightly later context. Then we have Tamil grammar work of Tolkappiyam. Tolkappiyam is also sometimes dated to early period. It has 3 sections, Eduthu, one talks about script, and then Sol, word, and Purul, meaning. Also it presents a beautiful literary theory about the concept of Thinai. Thinai is actually about the categories, the category of ecological life. There are 2 Thinais of Agam and Puram. The Agam is about inner life and private and love life. These poems deal with the personal life and the love life. And Puram is about heroic and war poems. They deal with the activities of the kings and fight between the various groups of people. Then we have landscape categories called 5 Thinais or 5 categories. This theory is very interesting, in which the various landscape, Kurinji, Mallai, Marudam, Neidal, Palai. Kurinji is the hilly area, Mullai is the area, forested area, Marudam is the riverine tract, Neidal is the coastal area, Palai is a dry area. Actually, Palai is rather seasonal. Mullai region can become Palai in the summer season. Palai means desert. We don't have actually desert. It is a seasonal. Again, all these land categories had different kinds of population, different kinds of flora and fauna and ways of life. So they are also brought out in the literature. So each Thinai, each region will have a peculiar kinds of plants and animals. They are incorporated in the poem. So this theory is very beautiful. Actually this grammar and all these work is discussed by Tolkappiyar, which is considered an important work. And also Tolkappiyar very interestingly categorizes the creatures like, one with single sense, double sense, triple sense, 4 sense, 5 sense, 6 sense. So very interestingly you can find evidence, probably some scholars say it is a Jain idea of that plants and other animals also have life and they have been categorized. So probably this idea goes to ancient Indian philosophy. You also find another beautiful 10th century poem of Tirumula's Thirumandiram, which talks about 7 birth, and it is somewhat reminding this idea of evolution. One has to undergo, you are born as a kind of tuber, and then you are born as a grass, and this is being sung by Tirumular. You can see some traces or elements of idea of something like evolution, not exactly. So you find very interesting concepts about ecology and the environment in these poems. How Indians classified the world and the plants and all that. You can't directly relate to the modern way of science, but in a sense you can see how they were visualizing the world and landscape. That could be understood from these poems. But if you look at the literature, we have a lot of information which cannot be directly taken to be true. Sometimes there are poetic exaggeration. We have publications by several researchers like N. Subramaniam, K.K. Pillai, S. Singaravelu, and early researchers, they try to directly interpret, taking all kinds of information they did not look at critically, and we have publication by Professor Rajan Gurukal and Sudarshan Sanaviratne. They try to understand the social formation, try to look at the Sangam literature data from a theoretical perspective. They have constructed their ideas on the settlement and social formation. My work involves in looking at literature, and also I work with the archaeological side. So I try to understand the Nadu formation and try to correlate the evidence based on the excavation. I have excavated an archaeological site which is mentioned in the Sangam literature. I am also working with the medieval literature, which also talks about about the settlement and landscape. So my approach has been to look at archaeology and also literature and understand settlement and landscape perspectives, how people were constructing spaces and landscapes, how these ideas changed over this period. So coming to the way the Sangam literature was approached earlier, when this nationalist movement was there in its heights in the early part of 20th century, and also this Tamil or Dravidian movements were there. So the Sangam period was seen as an advanced society. It was seen as a golden age. It was seen as a casteless society, and the influence of Sanskrit or other cultures of North India was seen as minimal. So that was an approach adopted in the early period. After 1950s, scholars have started looking at the literature more critically, trying to evaluate Sangam literature as a historical source. After 1960s only, they started using the literature for archaeological interpretation. So now we can say that we have a slightly better understanding of that. Again, the terms, some of the terms used in the literature cannot be directly interpreted. So when you look at the literature, you see several agencies like vendors or chiefs, and they are being very dominant. Again, we need to, when we look at a literature, we have to look at what contributed to its production. That is very important. If somebody is writing something, why he is writing, what is the agency behind the composition of the poem. So when you look at these poems, actually the poems were composed mainly for the chiefs and are as vendors, who are considered as a higher class of political entities. They wanted poems to be sung in their names so that their fame and their territory's fame can be known. So the bards, there is an alliance between the chiefs and the bards who sings this particular poem want something in return. So in a way, this bard records the history, history within quote, or the fame of this particular person, and he sort of, it's like some kind of, you can say, journalism within quote, trying to spread the fame. This, I am trying to see this as a mechanism to control territory, because there was no state or a strong political entity. There is a tendency to argue that Sangam age period, this Tamil region had states. State, you know about the entity called state. Even the Mauryan state, as it was argued earlier, it was seen as a very centralized. Even Chola state in the medieval period was seen as a very centralized. Now scholars are trying to really look into the functioning of the state, not from the top, from the bottom, by looking at the inscription very closely. Noboru Karashima, by looking at the medieval inscription, try to understand the state and its component, how actually functioned. So when you look at this early historic Tamil kingdoms, some scholars are of the view that they were all states. They cite a lot of references. From Rajan Gurukal is of the view that it is a very tribal society. He says that society was very fragmentary, very poor and all that. So I am taking a stand in between, say that there were certain political formations. We cannot call them as state. So these political formations were looking for legitimization. They were not really controlling the territory. Rather, they were like chiefdoms. They were trying to create alliances. They were using the bards who could sing their fame as a kind of agency to create an impression that these territories were there under control. Sometime for example, there is a text called Pattinapalai, which was composed for the Chola king. So by creating these kind of literature, the poets link the town and the chief. So already Karikal Chola was in control of the town. So these singing of poems helped the chief to establish their status and power. It also benefited the poets. So that is how this kind of system worked, and it led to the development of lot of poems. And coming to the other aspect, early historic period is a time when Indo-Roman or Indian Ocean trade was there in full swing. We have a lot of evidence for merchants moving across, and they were probably introducing the text and writing. We have a lot of inscriptions written on pottery and other sources, about which I will talk tomorrow. So clearly we have these several agencies or players acting in the early historic period, contributing to the composition of these Sangam corpus. Actually, originally these poets were composing the poems. They were collected into anthologies in the later period, somewhere in the 7th, 8th century. The composition of poem is different, and its and the compilation into anthology is different. So the people who wrote the anthology, they wrote at the bottom as a colophon. They are called, it was sung by whom, sung for whom. So you get that particular evidence in a later context. We have to keep this in mind. Sometimes we get reference to the poets only from the colophons which were written in the later period. So coming to the political formation of this period, Rajan Kurukal has argued that there were different levels of political organization. One at the level of settlements. He calls them as Kirar or Kiravan. Kiravan means an elderly person. The next category is Velir, who probably the person who was controlling a larger territory. The next category was Vendar. So Vendars are the one who find reference in the Ashokan inscription. Obviously they were important. We have Chola, Chera and Pandya. So clearly when we look at the Ashokan inscription reference and this Vendar as a suffix, we can clearly understand that they were of politically significant entity, these Vendars. So they were mainly in the important fertile tracts. Each Vendar controlled two towns, one interior town and one coastal town. You take the case of Chola, he controlled Urayur near Tiruchirappalli or Srirangam as his capital, Kaveri Pumbattinam, a port town, Pandya, Madurai, interior capital, Korkai as a port town, Chera, he had Vanji and again Musiri. So clearly these chiefs had some control over the territories and they were controlling the important towns. Even if you look at Periplus, the text of Roman text produced in the 1st century BC, it also mentions very interestingly about Caprabathos. This particular name matches with the reference in Ashokan inscription. Kelaputho and Periplus mention about Caprabathos, which is interpreted as Keralaputra. Interestingly, Periplus also mentioned about Kanyakumari and people from different parts of India coming to Kanyakumari and to take a sacred dip in the point Kanyakumari. So very interestingly, we find this ancient Indian considering these joining of two landscape or confluence of rivers as sacred. So this particular reference in Periplus is very important. And so all these three Vendars, they were controlling two major towns, which shows that clearly they had controlled the trade also. Even in the case of Baroch, I think the text Periplus mentions about the conflict between two entities to control the Roman trade. So obviously when the Roman ships came, the local chiefs were very interested because the trade contributed to the local wealth. Again, we get references in the literature singing about the wealth of the town. If you look at the Tamil literature, it talks in great detail about the major town. So it says about this Roman wealth coming into the town, taking the pepper back. So the trade activities are also discussed. So therefore all these corroborative evidences help us to place this literature in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, and also they help us to understand these are the major political entities. So these are the territories of ancient Tamil Nadu. You can say this is Chera country, Chera and Pandya and Choda and Edilmala. These settlements names are also there in the literature. That is very interesting. So if you list the names of settlements mentioned, that's what I am trying to do. As an archaeologist, I try to identify the place names mentioned in the literature, then I identify the same name mentioned in the inscription, then I go to the villages and check. So it is a 3-pronged approach you can call. And what happens after the arrival of, you can say Brahmins or Sanskritization, some of the village, settlements name were changed into Sanskrit. For example, if you look at Tamil literature, the village, a village name was Kudamuk. Kuda means, here you have, Kudanadu, actually Kudahu, Kurg. The place called Kuda means west. Ancient Tamil literature refers to Arabian Sea as Western Sea. Even I think Sanskrit sources also have a different name for this. Bay of Bengal is referred to in old Tamil literature as Eastern Sea. So you also get a lot of landscape description. Kudanadu is, Kuda means west, Nadu means country, and that is also found mentioned in the Tamil literature. Kuttanadu, it is mentioned in Greek sources as Kottanara, and Venadu. These are the other territories mentioned in the literature. So, for example, the term Kudamuk, Kuda means west, it is a village called Kumbakonam. Muku is this, actually this has been translated to Sanskrit as Konam. So many village names, if you look at the Devaram, they list the pure Tamil names. And if you go to the same village, the deity's name is Sanskritized. So you find a lot of changes in the names. By looking at the maps or Google Earth or Wikimapia, you can correlate these settlements and other data. You can understand how the village name, say 2000, say about 1st century BC, changes over the year. Sometimes some of the names have changed so drastically you can't imagine. Therefore, when we want to work with place names are also very important. And when we want to work with the place names, we have to carefully go into the literature and then inscriptions. You can't jump into any kind of conclusions. So this is another map showing these early territories. So coming to the hilly areas, you get a beautiful description of the landscape. Kurinji is the hilly area which we can take as the Western Ghats region. It mentions about Kuravan, and also it mentions about food gathering activities, and it also mentions about the hunters and gatherers, and also very interestingly, shifting cultivation or Zoom cultivation is also very mentioned. So some of these so-called hunter-gatherers, they were also practicing agriculture. So you get a very beautiful description of the landscape and all the trees that are found, and the way of life, what they are eating. They were eating roots and honey, that is beautifully brought by the poem. Coming to the Marudam tract, the farming groups are mentioned, and the Marudam groups were occupied by these Velir chiefs, and their towns are also spoken. And Mullai is the forested tracts where you have these pastoralists, and their life is spoken in the Mullai area. And in the coastal area, it speaks about Pardavar. and they are fishing and salt production, and they are also involved in the trade. So another important component in Indian history which I found is the history of the fisher folk. I think this has not been given much importance. If you look at the fisher folk right from Gujarat down to say Bangladesh, they have been very backbone of maritime activity. They have been very supportive of the Europeans and the colonial people arrived, especially for landing. They have been very crucial. Even now you can see that they are very strategic communities even for contemporary defense purposes. And their knowledge, they could negotiate the backwaters and they could, bring the ships and everything. And it is very beautifully spoken in the early literature, how they were catching fish and how they were building crafts. So this is one community which needs to be focused more in Indian history. Mapping of the fishing community and their technology. Even I have worked with some of them. They have very clear knowledge of different kinds of winds and the pattern, and they have their own names. We call the monsoon as southwest, northwest. They have different names for different patterns of the wind, and their life is very beautifully brought out. And we get also references to their activities. Clarence Maloney has written a book on that, on this particular community. It was published as an article published in 1969, and this community is very important. And in the southern part of Tamil Nadu, they had intense relationship with the communities in the coastal area of Sri Lanka. You have certain terms related to them occurring in the inscription. You also find them incorporated as part of Bhakti movement in a later context. I think if you look at the Bhakti literature, one of the Bhakti saint was fisherman, one of them was a hunter, one of them was Pana. You can see them, these communities being incorporated as part of Bhakti movement in the early medieval period, and they were the one who were supporting the traders, especially Roman traders and other traders. And salt was one of the important commodity that was traded much interior. There are descriptions about salt merchants who go in bullock cart, who take their monkeys also, and it is the women who drives the bullock cart. That is also portrayed in the literature. On the highway, they camp nearby the road and they cook and then leave and depart. So these kinds of sites are also mentioned in the Tamil literature. Palai, actually sorry for the spelling mistake here. Palai is actually the dry zone, which is again seasonal. Mullai region become Palai in the summer. Palai in Tamil means desert, but here the meaning is not desert, it is a seasonally dry zone. And the literature talks about Marava warriors who were involved in hunting and robbery. Again, there is a spelling mistake, hunting and robbery. And the traders, the Yavanas are also mentioned in the Tamil literature. When the traders were traveling across the dry regions, they were employing the Yavana warriors to protect them. So this also shows that the state was not a very organized entity in the early historic period. And also you find a lot of references to the social divisions, especially the literature, Purananur 287, talks about Panan, Parayan, Thudiyan, Kadamban as communities. So we also have the reference Idi Pirappalan in literature, the idea of lower born. So clearly you have these ideas emerging in some of the text. We can't say the caste was there, but it's definitely social division was there. People were living in different communities as group. That is brought out by the numerous references. Coming to the cultural developments, we have a new category of settlements called towns emerging, and that is being distinguished by the name. So as I said, village name is very important. Ur, sometimes they call it Pattanam or Niyamam. So the new settlement, the term Pattanam or Pattinam, Patan is Prakrit in origin, or it's not Tamil origin. So some of the port towns, they have the suffix Pattanam, like Button. You have in Prabhas Button and other coastal towns. of Gujarat, you have this name occurring in the early historic context. Clearly, the connectivity is established. So we also have parallel Tamil term for that as Munturai. And also the towns are spoken as rich with a lot of wealth, clearly implying that the wealth brought out by the maritime trade. So that is also reflected in the literature. Again, the poets are very interesting creatures, very intelligent individuals who had very good knowledge of the text and they were well versed. These poets acted as advisors to the kings or the chiefs. They also acted as philosophers. Some of them were friends to the kings, and they mention about people without learning. They use the term kalla. They also talk about the ills of killing animal, the idea of non-violence. So when you look at the text and their activities, some of the poets, they also talk about poets who are commercial. They mention Vaniga Parisilan. They say that it means some people sing just for getting wealth. So some poets say that I am not of that type. So they are probably exalted individuals who try to spread the idea of non-violence, also the destructive nature of the battles. So we get a lot of references to the clashes between various chiefs, burning of agricultural field. Sometimes very good crops are burned by these chiefs because of enmity. So here the poets advises the king, why do you do that? So they also, it's like kind of a peace lovers and messenger, they try to create goodwill. That is the picture that we get from the literature. So it clearly we understand that they were well versed. They also had visited the landscape. They were traveling across, they were meeting people. So it was a new kind of institution. I think these points I already mentioned about the development of long distance trade, connection with the Western world, and the settlement names with the suffix. And also there is one village name with Mangalam, probably indicating some kind of donation to the Brahmins. So my work basically concerns with the identifying the settlements mentioned in Sangam literature, why they use different terms like Ur, Kudi, Mudur, Perur, Seri, Annex, Pattinam. So I am trying to look at the terms that are found in the literature and their actual dimension on the size. Generally there is a tendency to look or excavate big sites with a lot of antiquities in archaeological language. So what I am trying to understand is look at the landscape. I have excavated a small site which covers few hectares and also excavated at the site of Arikamedu. So only when you excavate a site which is in the interior and also the largest settlements, different categories, you can really comprehend the settlements. So I am trying to work on this kind of settlement and landscape patterns. And also Prananu has a reference to Ramayana and Rama and Sita. This is also very interesting, saying that there are ideas and connectivities. So early historic South India was not an exclusive region. Say at least from you have evidence of Buddhism in Sri Lanka. Clearly people were traveling. Even my impression is that the connectivity between India, within India, started in the Iron Age. We sometimes underestimate the connection. Even if you look at Sri Lankan history, probably some of the, Gujarat had a connection with Sri Lanka through maritime. Similarly, Bengal also. So we are sort of ignoring this early connectivity. My question has always been, we talk about Gujarat's connection with West Asia, right? Did these Gujarat or Harappans, did they go to South India? Did they connect? We don't know. We are very blank in that area. My impression is, if you look at the material culture, the Iron Age has a lot of Cornelian bead. Scholars generally consider the Cornelian coming from this region. So I think India was very well connected, say right from the 1st century BC. So ideas were moving. If not people, we can't say people were very isolated. People were very well connected, but we underestimate. Even my impression is correct, because if you look at Andhra Pradesh, we have some evidence for some black on red ware pottery occurring in late context. Andhra Pradesh, some scholars who are working, I don't know, I'm not a person from linguistics, who are working with Telugu, they say it has more Prakrit influence. So I am trying to see that probably there were movement of Prakrit speaking people in an early period. So we have this contemporary notion of North India, Prakrit, Sanskrit, South India as, Dravidian. So my impression is we have to go beyond these categories. Probably some Prakrit speaking people moved maybe from this region. This is based on my observation on ceramics. But again, this needs to be worked, as I said, from below, by looking at ceramic typology, by looking at the ceramic categories of neighboring cultures. So we should not view South India also as entirely isolated or entirely Dravidian. So there were groups moving, and sometime probably they may have lost their language also. So so we need to work on the eastern part of India, especially Bihar and this particular region, Bihar and central India, Bengal and Orissa connectivity. We have been always looking at west in the sense that, this area pursuing civilization and its movement. Rather, we need to look differently. So this evidence of Ramayana definitely points out the movement of ideas. People were not isolated. These points I already summarized. There were varied developments, multiple population groups. So it's not just Aryan as one monolithic. So my impression is that some early migrants to northern India or Ganga Valley cultures could be an early form of Prakrit speakers. So what we are dealing with is multiple layers of migrations of different groups about whom we are not able to comprehend. So we pick up one or two categories and try to fit in that. I think the reality is much more complicated. I think one needs to look at the text. That's what I also say, that sometimes archaeologists who works with only material, if he or she is not looking at the literature, they are not able to comprehend. Similarly, person who is working with literature, they selectively use archaeology, it can be dangerous. So similarly, when we use, when we do scientific analysis also, that is what my understanding, we send some sample to scientific scholars who analyze, and they come up with the result, and it can go completely wrong. Where scientists who analyze the material should also be familiar with the archaeological material. So we are dealing with, lakhs and millions of pottery. So when we analyze the same forms, we should also understand the scientific part of it. So that is where we will be able to better come up with a better conclusion. So if we selectively use any kind of source or material, it can be dangerous. So what we see in South India is the development of life ways according to the local cultural landscapes, and ideas and influence from all kinds of tradition came up. It was not entirely isolated. And again, it was not a product of migration or external stimuli. What we see is a complex development leading to this culture in the early historic period. Thank you. Yeah.